Welcome back, everyone, to Reformed Polemics, where today we're going to be discussing the doctrine of Scientia media, or otherwise known in English as middle knowledge. And today we're going to be discussing a particular historical view of two different distinct kinds of approaches to the doctrine of middle knowledge. While it's commonly assumed that adherents of Reformed theology uniformly dismiss the doctrine by maintaining a strict necessitarian view of God's decree, there was in fact another approach within the Reformed school of thought. Again, one that upheld a strict necessitarian or more deterministic view in terms or in relation to the decree and God's foreknowledge, while another view adopted a more broader perspective on divine foreknowledge, proposing a hypothetical vision preceding any divine decree, or in other words, a consideration of secondary causes that God may actualize according to his will, while not necessarily adhering or adopting a middle knowledge in God. And so the reason why this is important to bring up is because I believe a more common or default way of refuting middle knowledge within Reformed circles is that very thing that we just discussed, that the way to get rid of it, or the way to refute it, is to simply assert that God cannot know anything apart from what he decrees, or essentially God only knows, or God only foreknows what he has already decreed. And of course, we're going to talk about the ramifications of such implications, and we're going to talk about the meaning behind why it's not necessarily the best approach. And we're going to be looking at a historic view as to what I believe to be a better approach to answering the doctrine of middle knowledge. Now, the video outline for today will be as follows. We're going to be discussing a brief overview of the origins of middle knowledge and what it teaches. We're going to try to be concise in order to not prolong the length of the video, but of course, more importantly, we're going to be delivering an accurate conception and foundational thought of what middle knowledge is and what it was originally meant to be or taught. And then we're going to be, of course, offering the preliminary engagement with the Reformed of regards to middle knowledge. Now, what this means is we're just simply going to briefly trace the engagement from the first time it was engaged with in the Reformed churches up until the point where later theologians in the high Orthodox period of Reformed theology engaged with it more specifically with a greater emphasis. And of course, after we discuss trace the preliminary engagement with middle knowledge, we're going to be going over the two schools of thought within Reformed theology. Now, I say two schools of thought not to necessarily divide the Reformed into two different ways or two different camps, but one can argue that they are kind of distinct in its approach, namely because both approaches can lead to significantly different understandings, especially when it comes to secondary causes, the freedom of the will, and other contingencies that relate back to God's foreknowledge and decree, and other such stuff like reprobation, predestination, and so on and so forth. But that's practically the reason why I chose to term the point two schools of thought, namely just to distinguish between one school that teaches a certain thing and the other school that basically delivers a more holistic approach that doesn't necessarily use a strict deterministic thought, as we'll discuss later on in the video. But of course, the last point is actually offering the counter argument or resolution to middle knowledge, basically breaking down the points and refutations one by one, or what I believe to be the consensus among all the Reformed theologians as to why middle knowledge ought to be rejected and why the Reformed never really adopted it, and ever since its conception within the Reformed churches has been met with fierce opposition. And so we're going to be going over, lastly, through those points in which, like I said, I believe to be the consensus among all the Reformed, despite having a little bit of a different approach. I believe that it can be narrowed down to a few points that we can discuss and determine as to why the Reformed ultimately rejected the doctrine of middle knowledge. Now, of course, to give a brief overview of the doctrine of middle knowledge, we, of course, have to go to the person of Luis de Molina. Of Of course, middle knowledge is often synonymous with Molinism, and Molinism, of course, directly entails or directly signifies the teachings of Luis de Molina, a Spanish 16th century theologian in the Roman Catholic tradition who is famous for putting forth a very concrete and well-established understanding of the doctrine of middle knowledge. Now, there are, of course, debates as to where exactly the thought or concept of middle knowledge originated. Some believe that it more so originated with Luis de Molina's mentor, his mentor being Pedro de Fonseca, a 16th century philosopher, Jesuit philosopher in, again, the Roman Catholic tradition, who many believe to have influenced Luis de Molina's concept of middle knowledge. But it is more widely accepted that Molina introduced a more accurate development in respect to the actual understanding of middle knowledge. And so most people look to Molina as the person who fully developed the concept and wrote about it in a pretty extensive manner. And so I believe in order to determine and provide an accurate conception of the doctrine of middle knowledge, we can in fact go to Molina, specifically in his Concordia, where he writes on the subject of divine foreknowledge. And so, in terms of Molina's understanding of divine foreknowledge, it's important to note that there are categorically things that may necessarily precede middle knowledge, but one thing that is for sure is that Molina does input the two different or classical understandings of divine knowledge in terms of natural and free knowledge. So before we actually consider, or before actually Molina considers middle knowledge, he does give a groundwork as to the understanding of how God may know purely possible things, and how God actually knows all possible contingencies, whether those that are actual or those that remain hypothetical. So before introducing middle knowledge, Molina actually gives the two different types, like I said. Natural, whereby he knows all possibilities according to the mediation of secondary causation, and free knowledge, whereby he knows absolutely and determinately, without any condition or hypothesis, which ones from among all the contingent state of affairs were in fact going to obtain, and likewise which ones were not going to obtain. Now, many theologians believe that this understanding of divine knowledge pretty much encompasses all things that are knowable within God's perspective, right? So if it considers something that is purely possible before any divine decree, then of course it ought to include pretty much everything that God may or may not will to create. And of course, as well as free knowledge, where in certain events or in a certain world that God can choose or choose not to actualize, God knows these contingencies, secondary causes that would pretty much bring about His will, whether those that are actual, whether those are hypothetical. Namely, God knows the things that bring about His cause, that bring about His will. Or in certain scenarios, God knows these certain contingencies and these certain conditionals, whereby He may know them in respect to what actually happens, in respect to the actual history, or in respect to something that remains hypothetical, sometimes something that doesn't actually come into, as Molina says, something ones that do not actually obtain a real hypothesis. And so, in order to understand middle knowledge, of course, like I mentioned, Molina gives a sort of groundwork to understanding the general concept of God's knowledge. And like I said, up to this point, virtually all theologians with pretty much within the Catholic and Protestant schools of thought readily affirm this. Even within the Reformed, you will pretty much see anyone who discusses the subject of divine foreknowledge concedes the fact that there are natural and free knowledge. There is a natural and free knowledge in God, whereby He does know all the possibilities and all the contingencies of futurity. Now, of course, we're going to be discussing why the Reformed don't necessarily object to this just yet, but we're not finished necessarily with Molina's insertion of a middle knowledge, which is where we come to a third new knowledge, of course, which, according to Molina, this knowledge is called middle knowledge, by which, in virtue of the most profound and inscrutable comprehension of each faculty of free choice, he saw in his own essence what each such faculty would do with its innate freedom, were it to be placed in this or in that, or indeed in infinitely many order of things, even though it would really be able, if it so willed, to do the opposite. Again, just to mention, this is a rather brief overview, but just to give a clarification and a thought, this is where a lot of theologians start to have a problem, even within Molina's own tradition. And so inserting a third type of knowledge, already admitting a knowledge whereby God knows futures, possibilities, and certain contingencies, there is a third type of knowledge that is asserted. Right? So the reason why it seems a bit idle or awkward to assert such knowledge is because one may already assume that when you speak of God's free knowledge or God's natural knowledge, that it basically encompasses or includes all knowable things within God in terms of God's decree. Or when we speak of foreknowledge, of course, we are speaking of certain things that God knows in regards to the future, or what things will come to pass in terms of what is possible, what is not possible, what actually happens in history, what actually remains hypothetical, what may be set forth or proposed as certain conditions, and those conditions that are either met or those conditions that are simply just proposed, for example, in Scripture. Now, to give a clear and concise understanding of what middle knowledge is, I will give an example of just a common example that I see used a lot, particularly in Scripture. For one example, David, when God advises him to not stay in Keilah, for if he had stayed, he would be handed over to Saul, who was in the middle of his persecution. And so, basically, the story in the Scripture goes is that God pretty much sets this condition forth to David, saying that if he stays, he will be delivered, although David did not end up staying in Keilah to be delivered up to the hand of Saul. This is where a third type of knowledge is inserted. So, to give an example or a practical understanding as to how middle knowledge works in this scenario, God basically can will or basically know what is going to happen without actually decreeing the condition or actually willing the contingency. So essentially, God knows that David would not stay, but it's not necessarily clear as to how God obtains this knowledge. Basically, it's simply asserting that without hindering or seeking to hinder any human freedom, God, without decreeing the necessary conditions to bring about this decision or the actual contingencies surrounding the scenario, God still knows this. And one may ask, how exactly does God acquire this knowledge? Well, you would not be the first one to ask how. But that's essentially how a particular middle knowledge is asserted. In more simple words, according to the concept of middle knowledge, God knows that David would not stay. And this awareness of such things exists independently of God's decree or any determination of contingencies by God. And so, of course, if you see a problem with that, well, that's exactly what the Reformed believed that was the problem, in that the will of God is somehow suspended into whether or not deciding or whether or not to know how David would react in a certain scenario, again, apart from the divine will. And of course, we're going to go into the more meticulous details of how we can approach it more carefully without falling into a determinism, or in other words, it's resolving this problem of middle knowledge by going and asserting in another extreme sense that God has to determine all things in order for a purpose or a decree of God to come into fruition. We're going to be discussing that in a short moment, but just to kind of give a recap of Molina's teaching, it is conceded to be rather innovative. Just to point out briefly, while we are still in the historical side of the video, it is important to note that even, for example, within Molina's own tradition, there sparked great controversies, specifically from the Dominican order, like notable theologians like Domingo Banez, Thomas de Lemos, and others who heavily opposed Molina's concept of a middle knowledge, claiming it to be idle, claiming it to be or make God a passive learner. And so before getting into the actual reform's objection to the actual doctrine, it's important to note that even, for example, in the Auxilian controversies, there were many disputes, many public disputes, many remarkable attacks on each other's order, the Jesuits against the Dominicans. It got so heated and so controversial that many bishops and even the Pope had to intervene. So on record, there is about 85 hearings and 50 formal debates in the presence of cardinals and other theologians from both orders. Ultimately, before the matter was decided, Molina was summoned to Rome, but unfortunately he died before the commission could reach a conclusion. So in short terms, the Roman Catholic tradition never really resolved this dispute. The manner in which it was resolved was simply by asserting that both sides can remain with these teachings as licit, and they were in fact prohibited from calling each other heretics. And so, as much as this doctrine wasn't received or welcomed within its own originating tradition, I think it's important to note that when the Reformed preliminarily engaged with this doctrine, it's interesting to note that it already had a sort of concept as to why it ought to be rejected, and this was borrowed by Dominican theologians such as Domingo Bañez, who was read very much in the Reformed tradition, specifically when it comes down to their own controversy within the canons of Dort. And so that brings me to the next point in terms of the preliminary engagement with the Reformed. Or the Reformed's preliminary engagement with middle knowledge. The first real encounter, of course, indirectly, may be traced back to Jacob Arminius, where it is believed that he was highly influenced by Molina's teachings, more specifically in terms of when it comes to predestination and the divine decrees. It is, as Richard Moeller asserts, it is widely considered that Jacob Arminius did adopt a lot of ideas. And according to Moeller, for Arminius, the idea of middle knowledge retained the direction given to it by Molina and became the philosophical underpinning of Arminius' doctrine of predestination. And so, of course, although it may be indirect, and although Jacob Arminius was not necessarily even present in the council, many of his ideas and doctrines actually led to that great controversy. Now, it wasn't until the High Orthodox period, again using the terminology in Richard Moller's Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics, it wasn't until the High Orthodox period within Reformed theology that you start to see a lot of theologians explicitly condemn the doctrine of middle knowledge. For in the early Orthodox period of Reformed theology, it was indirectly applied or combated, in the sense that most theologians in the Reformed tradition basically combated or engaged with Jacob Arminius' thought. And so it was, like I said, it wasn't until the period where you have figures or theologians like Francis Turretin or Petrus van Maastricht or Richard Baxter, Louis LeBlanc, Gaspertus Voetius, Willem Twissy, Wilhelmus de Brockel, even in the Netherlands. It wasn't until that period where you saw a more specific engagement with Luis de Molina himself and middle knowledge itself by name. For before that, again, it was mainly just an engagement with Arminius and the ramifications of his own doctrines, which led to, again, the controversies of Dort and the rejections of the Arminian doctrines. And so now we'll shift into the more particular response from the Reformed theologians in regards to the concept of middle knowledge. And we'll be looking at a distinct school of thought within the Reformed as to how we can actually state the question first, basically state what is not in disagreement, or basically what the Reformed are not trying to make an argument against, and then we're going to be discussing the actual problem and the actual resolution to that problem brought about by the Reformed. And so the statement of the question is critical to note, as one of the first or one of the major works against middle knowledge is from Turretin, where he states that the statement of the question is not whether God knows future contingencies, for all agree that God knows from eternity by question, a certain knowledge, not only things themselves, but all their combinations and connections, whether present, past, and future, or necessary and contingent. Rather, the question is whether they belong to a kind of middle knowledge distinct from the natural and free. So if you're not really familiar with how the Reformed engages with the doctrine of middle knowledge, it's important to note that it is inherently wrong to assert that God has no type of knowledge of any future contingency or a secondary cause, because that would be simply asserting full-blown necessitarianism. And the Reformed readily object to that, and we can even point to the first couple points of doctrine for example, Westminster Confession, where in the chapter 3 of God's eternal decree, it states, God from all eternity did by most wise and holy of his counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatever comes to pass. Yet so, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, keyword, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty of contingency of secondary causes taken away, but rather established. And so it's important. It's critical to note that when the Reformed reject the doctrine of middle knowledge, it is not to say that the Reformed reject these categories in which we distinguish between primary causes and secondary causes, or in other words, things by which God may bring about to pass according to secondary causes, and how God knows that from eternity past, and how God knows certain things that they may have various secondary causes, they may have various combinations and connections with each other, like Turretin says, both present, past, and future. So here we can start to differentiate a little bit in terms of how the problem is approached. And I said it pretty much in two different thoughts in regards to the futurity and the decree. How is it that God knows, and what is it that God knows? We already established what it is that God knows in terms of secondary causes, various connections, various contingencies, things that come about in future, past, present, etc., etc. But the question now is, how does God know it? Does God know it because his knowledge depends on a decree? Or can we assert a hypothetical knowledge of God, whereby he may know something without necessarily being the absolute direct cause of all things, even secondary causes? And so the first point, where it says God's foreknowledge depends on the decree, is what I mentioned earlier. What I believe has become the rather default way of combating middle knowledge, which is asserting or giving an assertion that because God is sovereign in his determination of a certain will, God can only know what he decrees. And of course, we're going to be looking at the ramifications and why it may not be the best approach to do that. But there are certain theologians in the Reformed tradition who do concede. I can think, for example, of William Twissey, who says that nothing can be future without God's decree. Or Turretin, that says no effect can be understood as future without the divine decree. And certain other theologians who also assert a similar view, in that God's knowledge is depending or solely dependent on the decree. In essence, God decrees something, therefore he knows. And it's important to note that not all the Reformed theologians in the Reformed school of thought approach the divine foreknowledge in this manner. For theologians such as Richard Baxter, Louis de Blanc, which we'll be looking at, believe that entails a method in which it makes God the ultimate author of sin. Other notes in regards to what Richard Baxter writes is that it's not necessarily the best argument to assert that no futurism can be known but as decreed, or as we were just discussing, that God only knows what he decrees. And Richard Baxter makes the point that it's not necessarily the part or the heart of the problem. The problem is not for us or for the Reformed to turn around and make a more deterministic approach to the knowledge of God, because again, that would basically make God the absolute director of all things, including sin, and that is what we start to run into a bit of a problem. This kind of approach does, like I said, seem to be more problematic than many may realize. Even myself, when I first encountered the concept of middle knowledge years ago, I believed that it would suffice to say that, well, middle knowledge is wrong because God predestines all things, and because he predestines all things, he only knows, or he can know, what he decrees. Therefore, a knowledge by which God stands idle is wrong. And I know, although the latter part may be correct, in that God could never be idle or a passive learner of certain knowledge, it is wrong to assume that God only knows, or God can only establish something to be future only in relation to his decree, namely making him the author of sin by directing all things absolutely, and by not giving the freedom of the freedom of secondary causes its true freedom, for it would make God the author and director of all things and of all movement. So Louis LeBlanc, another prominent Reformed theologian within the Reformed school of thought, says, "Indeed, it seems entirely fictitious, not only and not only repugnant to divine wisdom, but also to divine goodness, that decree by which some assert, as we mentioned above, that God predestined all possible connections and condensation of events before he decreed anything to be future. For if it were so, it would be necessary for God, before deciding to create this world, to have conceived such decrees within himself. Namely, if I will to create Adam, I will that his fall necessarily follows from his temptation." In essence, if God predestines something before actualizing something according to his will, LeBlanc argues that it follows that this would make God conceive of these decrees in himself. And again, like I mentioned before, the freedom of secondary causes would be eliminated. God would be the direct cause of, for example, the fall of Adam, and it would be within himself that God falls necessarily, because it follows from his decree. And so essentially what LeBlanc is saying is that if God decrees something before, or if God predestines something before he actually decrees it to be future, it does imply a wrong approach to the divine goodness and wisdom of God, namely making him the author of sin. And so, in contrast, as Richard Moeller writes, there is an alternative view to handle carefully, or with more careful consideration, the fact that God can foreknow something and at the same time not necessarily decree a particular order of things so as to make God the actual author of secondary causes. Richard Moeller writes, "Gormaius and Walseius and later Baxter, though repelled by the Pelagianizing impact of this view, adapted the argument of Molina to refer not to a scientia media between knowledge of the possible and of the actual, but a scientia hypothetica prior to all of the divine determinations. In this view, God rests his decretum upon his knowledge of how the world order is to be constructed in its most minute hypothetical workings. The decree, therefore, establishes the freedom of secondary causes and allows for or permits the eventuality of sin and evil, though only in a hypothetical sense, namely as events that will occur given the actuality of circumstances preceding them. The point, in other words, is not that God learns from or reacts to a future possibility, but that God actualizes a particular condensation of possibilities in which, given the particular set of circumstances directly willed, certain events will occur by reason of secondary causes, including the exercise of human free choice. The free choice belongs, therefore, to the particular world order that God wills to actualize. For as for God's foreknowledge of all such actual events, it is necessary, certain, and determinate, as it follows the decree and rests in the certainty of divine causality." Now, what Richard Moeller here notes is that rather than asserting a view where God gives a more necessitarian and deterministic view, or deterministic implication of his decree, it is not a wrong thing or a wrong approach to suggest that God can actualize a certain world where he, in the most minute, as he says, the most minute hypothetical workings according to the decree of God. In other words, God can actually establish and actualize a world where whatever God wills, he brings about according to secondary causes. It's not necessary that God directs all things and taking away from the contingencies of the freedom of choice and of secondary causes. But instead, we can learn that God does not have to react to a future possibility. He doesn't have to react to something that he is idle towards, and he doesn't have to decree it in order for him to know it. In essence, it doesn't have to imply such knowledge in God, or imply such knowledge in by which, as Richard Muller says, just to make it more simple, it is not that God learns from or reacts to a future possibility, but God can actually actualize a particular condensation of possibilities. Richard Baxter says the sense of the question of Scientia media is not de conditionatis necessaris, or conditional necessities, as if the sun set it will be night, but of such conditionals as have some reason of the connection, and yet leave the will in an undeterminate power to act or not act. But we know no difference between these ex parte de scientias, but only denominati extrinsica ex parte objecti. Therefore, the doctrine of God's knowledge of such conditional propositions and contingents, as so circumstantiated, seemeth true materially, that they are the objects of God's knowledge, but false efficiently, as if they were the cause of his knowledge, which hath no cause, but only extrinsical denominators of it in that act. So when I first read this from Baxter, I did not necessarily understand what he was saying, but after like 6 or 7 times of reading it, it became quite clear. It is not that the question or the contention between middle knowledge is about or whether or not God knows conditional necessities. An example: if the sun sets, it will be or it will be night, and etc. But the problem of middle knowledge is more so that it leaves the power of God, or in an undeterminate power, to will to act or not act according to what he learns what will happen between his free and natural knowledge. And so what Baxter basically says here is that as long as we can propose that the doctrine of God's knowledge of such conditionals are contingents as circumstantiated materially, meaning that they are not the objects of God's, they are not the objects, or rather they are not the causes of God's knowledge, but rather the objects of God's knowledge. And so when we propose that certain things which God sees before he makes a decree, we can simply assert that what he foreknows, what in his knowledge of vision, he sees as his objects, not that they are the cause of his own knowledge, so as to make him learn from these objects. LeBlanc continues to write, therefore, it cannot be reasonably denied, and must be conceived by all, that there is in God a certain knowledge of what would be freely and contingently future under a certain condition before we conceive of any actual decree in God about future things. The entire difficulty lies whether the condition under which something is said to be future must include a decree to pre-move and to predetermine the secondary cause to act, or whether it suffices that the decree, which according to that condition would be posited in God, is only about providing a certain concurrence that is indifferent in itself and which is determined by the secondary cause to a certain kind of action. All those theologians, LeBlanc continues to write, who believe that nothing happens without God's concurrence applying and predetermining the second cause to act, assert that no proposition about contingent and conditional futures has any truth, and therefore can be known as true unless the condition supposes a decree about pre-moving and predetermining the free agent. They argue that the futurity of any action depends on such decree, indeed, according to some, as a sole and solitary cause, and without such a decree, no action of secondary cause can be future. However, I hold the opinion that secondary causes perform many actions in time that are not predetermined by God, for we cannot see how God would not be the author of sin if he predetermined free causes to acts that are inherently sinful and intrinsically evil. For example, blasphemy and hatred of God. If some action of a free cause can exist without God's premotion and predetermination, then it is not necessary to posit or suppose in God a decree to pre-move and predetermine the creature to act for any action to be future or to have been future. But it suffices to decree the providing of a certain concurrence without which the creature cannot act, and which is truly necessary for its action. So I believe what LeBlanc says pretty much puts to rest the question of whether or not we ought to assert a preliminary decree by which God knows things, and the assertion put to rest the assertion that if God does not decree or predetermine something before he foreknows it, that it would basically lead to a false proposition within God. The reason why I believe is in explaining or sufficing why it's not necessary is what LeBlanc says, particularly in the second paragraph, when he says, if some action of a free cause can exist without God's premotion and predetermination, it is not necessary to posit or suppose in God a decree to premove and predetermine the creature to act for any action, to be future or to have been future. But it suffices to decree the providing of a certain concurrence without the creature, without which the creature cannot act, and which it is truly necessary for its action. In essence, it is sufficient to say that God can decree a world where the creature does have freedom of secondary causes, by which God is not necessarily the prime mover or the one who is predetermining every single secondary cause to act. Therefore, it is simply wrong to assert that nothing can be future without it actually being predetermined by God. For, again, it would simply lead to the plain assertion or the plain consequence of God being the actual author of sin. For in any action which God concurs with in regards to sin, would be God determining something that's sinful. And of course, as Reformed theologians, everyone rejected the idea of God predetermining sin, whether directly or indirectly. For any lack of rectitude is regarded as sin within the Protestant school of thought. Therefore, it must be conceded that not all things have to be predetermined, pre-moved, in order for something to be future, or in order for something to have a secondary cause, or effect in terms of that secondary cause, namely sin. And so the resolution for this, as LeBlanc said in the previous slide, is that it can be conceded by all that there is a knowledge of God, by which he knows what would be freely done, and in regards to the contingent future under a certain condition before God actually conceives of any actual decree about future things. And so it's not false to determine that according to God's knowledge, there can be a knowledge of vision, whereby God views, determines, and actualizes in the most minute way of concurrence. In other words, as Merchant Moeller said in the previous slide, the decretum upon which God does rest, his knowledge of how the world order is to be constructed in its most minute hypothetical workings. In essence, by which God can actualize a world where his cause is brought about by secondary effects. Of course, not excluding supernatural things or things in which God explicitly involves himself in terms of supernatural works or miracles, but simply in the ordinary cause of things by which things are brought about to pass according to secondary causes. And this is pretty much found within a various amount of Reformed theologians, such as Francis Turretin, Stephen Charnock, where both, if you read about the decrees and predestination of God in their works, concede that, yes, it may be true that according to the preliminary or primary cause, all things are necessary, but they are free and contingent according to secondary causes. And so, going back to the main point, it can be conceded and it can be taught that, again, there can be a knowledge of God whereby he envisions something and he decides to actualize it and determine his decree from that. That way, we are avoiding the fact or avoiding the assertion or consequence that he may be the author of sin by directly or indirectly willing his creatures to sin. And this can also be found in various amount of theologians. For example, one that may be regarded as more deterministic, such as Gisbertus Vodius, who says, I confess, indeed, it is necessary that God beheld from all eternity all possible modes of secondary causes in solitary or social actions, and therefore that he certainly knew what would or would not be in this or that occasion posited. But it is asked whether he foreknew this before the inspection of his decree, which God knows to be firm and immutable, and to bring the certain existence of a future event in execution. And so what we're not trying to do is rid the fact that there is a decree, or rid the fact that all things that happen, both past, present, and future, involve a decree. For all Reformed theologians have to concede that as according to the Westminster Confession of Faith, before actually talking about the freedom of secondary causes, does assert that God, by his most wise and holy counsel of his will, did ordain whatever comes to pass. And so that is in regards to the primary cause. And the argument here in regards to avoiding when talking about middle knowledge is that it's not necessary to imply that God has to know something or can only know something as future, so as long or cannot know something as future unless he actually decrees it or predetermines it to. For as we just discussed, the consequences must lead to him being the author or indirectly or directly of sin. For again, any lack of rectitude, anything that God may ordain that lacks rectitude, is of course sin. Francis Turretin, for example, writes, For since all things happen necessarily, nothing can take place contingently, but this does not take it away with respect to second causes, because the same decree which predetermined also determined the mode of fruition, so that the things having necessary causes should happen necessarily, and those things having contingent causes contingently. Therefore, the effect may properly be called both necessary and contingent at the same time, but in different respects. The former on the part of God and relative to the decree, the latter on the part of the thing and relative to the second and proximate causes, which might be disposed differently. Although in relation to the first cause, all things are said to be necessary, yet taking according to themselves certain things can be free, contingent and fortuitous because of each thing is and may be judged according to proximate and particular causes. Every effect in necessary and contingent and contingency follows the proximate cause and not the first, according to Thomas Aquinas. And in the same manner, Petrus von Maastricht writes, because God's idea and intuition, of which we heard that his knowledge consists, can be considered only in two ways, either in antecedent relation to his decree, under the notion of God's reason, and thus supplying his knowledge of simple intelligence, or in consequent relation to his decree, and thus supplying his knowledge of vision. And so, before we actually discuss the final part of the video and the sum of rejection of why the Reformed reject middle knowledge, it's important to concede this. It's important to concede the fact that in order to combat middle knowledge, you do not have to assert that God predetermines all things. That is why middle knowledge is wrong. No, as Petrus von Maastricht, I think, perfectly summarizes our point here, God's knowledge can be taken in two ways, antecedent and consequent to his decree. If we consider it antecedently to his decree, it falls under God's reason as supplying his knowledge of simple intelligence, his perfect intelligence and his perfect wisdom, so as to him being able to know and actualize what he wills and how he wills for it to come to pass, according to secondary causes, which is how he ordained the world to become. And so if God ordains a certain world to be achieved through secondary causes, it's not necessary to assert that every action must be physically pre-moved. And so that's important to regard in terms of this, in this school of thought within the Reformed tradition, in that it's not necessary to be a necessitarian or determinist in this sense to combat middle knowledge, for we can simply assert that before God decrees something, he can know a variety amount of things, even as we discussed in the beginning of the video, as to what the problem of middle knowledge is not, in regards to whether God knows future contingencies and future combinations and connections, past, present, and future. Again, that is not a statement of the question, and even as Richard Baxter says, it's not whether it's about the necessary conditions, but instead it is about the will of God being left in an undetermined power. And so that leads us to our final point of the video, which is the sum of rejection. This is basically the 3 points in which why the rejection of middle knowledge is asserted. Now that we have established that it's not necessarily because God doesn't decree everything or predetermine everything that middle knowledge is wrong, but rather it is more simple than that. Number one being it is superfluous, meaning it's unnecessary to the already free and natural knowledge of God. Second, that implies that God becomes an idle learner and passive receiver of knowledge from outside of himself, meaning that God receives knowledge from something outside of himself that is not in himself, and thus it forms a conjectural knowledge, basically an opinion or conclusion formed on the basis of an incomplete intelligence. And so this is basically the sum of rejection of middle knowledge. It's not necessary because all things knowable are already included in the natural and free knowledge. God becomes an idle learner, a passive receiver of knowledge. And then if God's a passive receiver of knowledge, then it must necessarily entail that God's knowledge is incomplete or it's illicit. And therefore, we injure the divine goodness and injure the divine wisdom by asserting a middle knowledge when it's simply not necessary to do so. And so Petrus von Maastricht writes, since every knowable thing is subject to the two received knowledges, natural and free, for if a thing is considered as merely possible, then undoubtedly it falls under natural, if it is considered as having a connection with various secondary causes, and thus a thing, and thus as a thing that will occur. It should be considered construed with those second causes, even though it will never really occur. It belongs to the latter knowledge that depends on the decree. Francis Turretin in a similar note writes, natural and free knowledge embrace all noble things and entities and are not to be multiplied unnecessarily. There is nothing in the nature of things which is not possible or future, nor can future conditional things constitute a third order, for they are such either from a condition only possible and powerful, yet never to take place, or from a condition certainly future and decreed. In the former manner, they do not recede from the nature of possible things, and belong to a natural knowledge. In the latter, they are future and decreed by God, and come under the free knowledge. And so, if every knowable thing can be conceived in something that may be possible, something that is actual, and something that is hypothetical, there is really no need for a middle knowledge. It's superfluous. It's unnecessary. It has no place here. If you try to assert a middle knowledge, all you do is contrast the knowledge of God and suspend it. Suspend it into a knowledge whereby God has incomplete intelligence of certain future actions and of certain contingencies and conditionals. And in that case, Gisbertus Vodius writes, for first, if God sees the effect already before, not by the power of the conditioned cause, determined in itself, outside of its causes, then he does not see it as contingent, but as necessary, which is indeed a grave atomia from the minds of the hypotheticals. Secondly, there will be something besides God, which has a being in itself from no cause. Thirdly, the second cause will be necessary determined to it, because of all the possibilities, this already before and outside its causes had from eternity future and a determinate being. Petrus von Maastricht can actually summarize what he says by saying, by middle knowledge, the intellect of God would draw its ideas from elsewhere, and thus it would depend on creatures. And on the other hand, the human will and its primary determination would be released from its dependence on God. And so, apart from middle knowledge being unnecessary and rather injurious to the divine works, it actually poses a sort of fate within God, meaning that God actually draws his knowledge from something other than himself, and the actual manner in which the human decisions and secondary causes come to pass actually becomes annexed, divorced from God's from the dependence of God. And so, as we see here, as we denoted from the sum of rejection, how it's unnecessary, how God becomes a passive and idle learner, and how it's conjectural, meaning it's based on incomplete knowledge, we can simply assert the fact that even in the examples provided by Molina and other Molinists in Scripture, where if God proposes a certain task or a certain condition, that it automatically means there is a middle knowledge in God, where God already knows without actually supplying the condition or willing the contingency, it's very simple to refute by simply asserting that they are simple and nothing other than just conditions that God sets upon the basis of our understanding, in terms of human understanding. As Francis Turretin said a little while ago, in terms of secondary causes, a thing can be considered as contingent, as having a contingent cause that can be connected to a various amount of causes. And so it's not necessary to assert that God proposes or God is proposing to have a middle knowledge. So, for example, in terms of the example provided earlier about David and being handed over to Saul in the city of Keilah, Wilhelmus of Brakel writes, this was not a prediction concerning a future event, but rather a revelation of current reality, which from a human perspective could have resulted in an event which as yet have not occurred. Since God had not decreed this event, however, he consequently knew that it would not occur. David inquires about that which is hidden from him, so that he may decide whether to stay or flee. God revealed to him that Saul would come down from Keilah, and that the hearts of the men of Keilah were not inclined towards him. Therefore, they would be determined to deliver David to Saul when he would come down, so that he already prepared himself according to the hearts of the middle of Keilah were already set against him. God revealed this to David, and upon viewing this from a human perspective, he could conclude that it was in his best interest to flee. Since God decreed the ultimate outcome of this event, he also decreed the means by which he would lead this outcome. Thus, if one views this text relative to the outcome of events, it follows that God's knowledge concerning the ultimate outcome of events is a result of essential omniscience. It is a result of God's singular and comprehensive knowledge, whereby he is cognizant of every possibility, rather than an imaginary immediate knowledge by which he would decree in response to the activity of man. And I believe that for a video purpose sums up pretty much the entirety of it all. Just to give a quick recap, in terms of the doctrine of middle knowledge and what it implies, asserting a third knowledge of God apart from what he already knows freely and naturally, there needs not to be an assertion on the part of the Reformed school that God can only know if he predetermined something to move or predetermined something to act. Rather, there can be taken a more holistic view. In essence, a view that allows for God to have his perfect, omniscient, and perfect wisdom without actually injuring the secondary causes and actually allowing the secondary causes to actually bring about his purpose. And this is actualized by God in his infinite wisdom, not predetermining every action to move, not physically pre-moving all of sinful actions to move, but rather, instead, giving the actual concurrence necessary to be able to bring these things to pass without actually him being the author of sin. And so that, of course, led to the conclusion by which we concluded that middle knowledge simply is not necessary. If God can know what is to be future based on his infinite wisdom, on which whatever world he wants to actualize, there's no necessity for a middle knowledge. There is no necessity for a third type of knowledge. God can actually actualize a world whereby his purpose comes to pass, and not necessarily willing or pre-moving a creature to sin, nor by asserting that he is acquiring this knowledge from an outside unknown source. And so this video may be rather concise or simple in regards to the overall definition of middle knowledge, but I think it's suffice to say that in regards to the Reformed rejection of middle knowledge, one can take a more holistic approach. And like I said in the beginning of the video, it seems to me that it has become default for the Reformed to reject middle knowledge on the basis of a necessitarian and deterministic view. But I hope in this video one may have learned that a different approach is more than welcomed and taught by many Reformed theologians in the Reformed school, and hopefully that you may be able to acquire more knowledge about this and do more reading and research as to what the Reformed taught overall about middle knowledge. But overall, I hope that this video was helpful, and if any questions, of course, just feel free to comment down. And in regards, thank you so much for watching.